This is the final project for Anatomy and Physiology of Speech by Alexis Smith, Audrey Olson, Jessica Burdyshaw, Lindsay Sproul, and Stephanie Klein. The situation we have decided to use for the statement of War Eagle is when fellow female CMDS 3400 student passes student recruiter Caroline Stewart and says, "War Eagle," conversationally on campus. But how did those words come to fruition? Before any words can be uttered, it is important to understand what happens within the lungs and how we obtain the air to speak. It is important to understand that any spoken word, regardless of level of volume, begins with active force inspiration. The primary muscles used for inspiration are the diaphragm, external intercostals, sternocleidomastoid, and scalenes. The diaphragm is the overall primary muscle in respiration, located underneath the ribs and extending into the abdomen. The external intercostals elevate the ribs upward and outward to allow the diaphragm space to move. The sternocleidomastoid elevates the sternum, the bone on the frontal plane of the body that connects all of the ribs to the rib cage. The purpose of the scalenes is to elevate the top two ribs. Contraction of these muscles occur in all three dimensions: anterior, posterior, lateral, and vertical. Boyle's law states that gases move from higher pressure to lower pressure to reach equilibrium. As inspiration begins, air flows from outside the body, which is higher pressure, into the lungs, which is lower pressure. The air enters the body through the nose or mouth, down the pharynx, larynx, and trachea, and flows in the lungs. The diaphragm flattens, formerly known as contraction, and enlarges the thoracic cage as it expands and the lungs fill with air. The thoracic cavity is comprised of the vertebrae, ribs, costal cartilages, and sternum. When speech begins, expiration of air also begins. Inspiratory muscle workings transition into expiratory muscle workings. It is imperative to know the difference between speech breathing and tidal breathing, or resting breathing. Tidal breathing is what our bodies naturally do, such as while we sleep at night or sit and take notes in class. Speech breathing requires constant pressure and flow in the upper airway. This air flows at a rate of 100 to 300 milliliters per second. This is where checking action comes into play. It is used to slow down or restrain expiration to capitalize on our expiratory reserve volume for speech. Checking action is needed at the beginning of speech production to avoid relaxed exhalation. During speech breathing, there are several expiratory muscles at work. The main ones are the muscles of the rib cage and the abdominal wall. The internal intercostals move the ribs downward and inward, which is the opposite of what the external intercostals do for inspiration. The abdominal wall consists of the rectus abdominis, external obliques, internal obliques, and transversus. While all of this happens, speech is typically produced in the middle range of possible lung volumes and involves alveolar pressure around 8 to 10 centimeters of H2O. Tidal breathing, instead, generates smaller alveolar pressures of about 1 centimeter of H2O by elastic recoil, called relaxation pressure. As alveolar pressure increases, so does the loudness of speech. As speech begins, the pressure in the lungs is high, which is why the air is expelled from the body. As Boyle would tell you, gas moves from higher pressure to lower pressure, which in this case is outside the body. As the air moves upward to leave the lungs, the larynx opens and the velum lowers, which makes breathing act like a sphincter does. It serves as a sound source for voice production by transferring the pressure. This is a non-biological role of the larynx, since speech is not mandatory for sustaining life. Also, English speech specifically is considered egressive, since air flows from the lungs to the air outside the body as speech is produced. As we stated before, we are looking at a situation in which War Eagle is spoken with typical volume and loudness. Loudness encompasses subglottal pressure, vocal fold vibratory phase closure, transglottal flow, and supraglottal vocal tract tuning. There are two major considerations that need to be taken into account for speech production. The first is aerodynamic. Airflow requirements for speech are not much larger than those needed for tidal breathing, and there is a consistent subglottal pressure throughout utterance. The other is acoustic. It involves frequency, amplitude, and duration. The frequency of voice regards the rate of vibration of the vocal folds. The faster they vibrate, the higher the frequency and pitch sounds. Amplitude means the magnitude or size of the vocal fold vibration. The greater the magnitude, the louder the voice becomes. Finally, duration is the total amount of time the vocal folds vibrate. The longer the vibration, the longer the voice is produced and uttered out loud. Voice onset begins at expiration, only lightly though, since this is conversational speech. With regards to acoustics, the speech is produced at middle frequency, mid amplitude, and typical duration of conversational speech. Expiration is longer for speech breathing than it is for tidal breathing, which partially due to the resistance of elastic recoil. During passive expiration, there is a changing of shape to original shape after tidal breathing. This is what speakers must resist while talking through checking action, which we described earlier. Speech breathing occurs around mid-level lung volumes of 60 to 85% vocal capacity, while passive recoil is supplemented by active muscles. As expiration continues, the muscles compress the rib cage and abdomen, thus forcing air out of the lungs. The diaphragm then relaxes and returns to its resting dome shape. Throughout the phrase of war eagle, the larynx is considered on the entire time it is uttered, meaning it is completely voiced. This is because there are no nasal phonemes in the phrase. The velum is closed the entire time with a high degree or oral air pressure. An adult female's vocal lengths are about 11 to 15 millimeters, while adult male's vocal fold lengths are 17 to 21 millimeters. Now we are going to run through each letter written in the word war eagle and briefly speak about how the letters are used in the word and how they are pronounced phonetically if they are pronounced when saying war eagle. W. We exhale and voicing begins, the lips round, and constriction is considered mid-central. A. The velopharyngeal port is closed, with a relatively restricted pharyngeal oral airway. The lips are still somewhat rounded from the beginning of the W sound. R. The airway is still somewhat restricted with a tight velopharyngeal port closure. The lips are spread in preparation for the E sound at the beginning of the word eagle. E. Constriction has now moved to high front and the velopharyngeal port is still closed. The lips are now spread completely. A. The velopharyngeal port is still closed. The A is part of the grapheme, or spelling, of the word eagle, but is not pronounced phonetically. G. The place of articulation is velar, or tongue velum. The G phoneme is a stop phoneme, especially a stop plosive in production. The velopharyngeal port continues to be tight and the lips begin to be less spread and a bit more rounded. L. There is a tight velopharyngeal port closure. There is also forward co-articulation and assimilation between the G and L sounds of this word. When written in IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet form, there is no vowel between G and L, and there is a diacritic mark to identify the sound called a syllabic L, such as the one used in the word bottle. E. The place of articulation is alveolar with no lip rounding. Just like the A in the word eagle, this last letter is important for the grapheme of the word, but is not phonetically pronounced. It's always great to be an Auburn Tiger. War Eagle.